Welcome to Occupy Ottawa!
We are here because we are the 99% and we are sick of the 1%. Woo! Woo!
Confederation Park over the weekend, where hundreds of people gathered to occupy Ottawa. Today marks 1 month since the Occupy Wall Street protests began, and since then the protests have spread across the U.S., Canada and the world. Patrick McCurdy teaches communications at the University of Ottawa. He studies the relationship between social actors and the media. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining us. First of all, what was your experience with Occupy Ottawa over the weekend?
My experience was incredibly positive. I've been away in Europe for the last 8 years, and so I wasn't sure what to expect when coming down to protest in Ottawa, and I was pleasantly surprised by the atmosphere and by the number of people who came out.
Well, describe the scene for us.
Well, the scene was, you had a lot of activists, individuals, people, citizens of all ages, really, there with different signs talking about issues from sort of climate change to corporate taxation. It was well spirited and I think well attended for what I was expecting.
Really? Because I heard only several hundred people came out, and that surprised me.
Yes, there were only 700 people, and I think Ottawa itself, as I'm sure the listeners know, is a very conservative town. But what I think is also important is recognizing that this one event was part of something worldwide, right? Something in over 80 countries, 950 cities, all had events. So in that sense, it was small, but it was also, I think, very, very symbolic that there were people gathered for an event like this.
Okay. I'd like to get your sense of the media coverage of the weekend's protest, not only the one in Ottawa, but in the other cities.
Sure. Well, I think the media coverage, and again, painting with a broad brush, the media coverage unfolded the way in which you would expect almost any protest or social movement to unfold. And this is because I think the mainstream media uses very typical sort of forms or stories when they cover protests. So it focused initially on despite the explicit sort of emphasis by the movement, it was using peaceful tactics, on the potential for violence, on some small business bracing themselves for violence. And then the coverage of the event focused on numbers and the way in which the numbers, whether it was 3,000 in Vancouver, 400 in Calgary, 500 in Ottawa, the way in which the numbers were emphasized depended on what the agenda or perspective of the news organization was. So it could be pitched as a surprisingly high turnout or a disappointing turnout, depending on what what angle they wanted to present the story at.
What about the criticism, though, that there's been no coherent message from the protesters with which to cover?
Yes. And one thing you could see, if you go down to Occupy Ottawa, you look online, there are a multiplicity of messages. And the way in which journalism works, journalists and the media need a news hook, and that is often easier if there is a single slogan that can be discussed, right? And what Occupy Wall Street has shown is that there's a multiplicity of issues. There's multiple problems. And in my mind, when you look at these issues, this is at a meso level or the middle level. At the larger level, a lot of these things, whether it's banking regulation, climate change issues, labor issues, relate back to the state of global capitalism. So to me, this means that the absence of a single message doesn't mean there's just one problem or one demand, but it means there's multiple problems or multiple demands. And I would see a lot of the critics who would say, well, there isn't just one message. I would see that more as a rhetorical strategy used to be dismissive of the movement by those who are keen to keep the current system as it is and try and sort of cut off any dialogue by dismissing them by saying there isn't any sort of single message.
Or if I were an activist or organizer, I might harness that proclivity of the media to treat stories that way and provide them with something, a hook, right?
This is it. And so, I mean, you have seen over the last decade sort of activism evolve and try and sort of come together with trying to devise messaging, right, and trying to devise ways in which you can try and influence your coverage. Because the media does work in a weird sort of way. If you think about how the coverage of the release of the latest iPad 2, where people slept overnight in the Rideau Centre to obtain it, this was covered in a rather jovial way. These people were seen as as diehards, as sort of upstanding, committed consumers who just want to have the latest piece of technology. If you contrast that to the ways in which individuals who, instead of sleeping out at a mall to buy something, individuals sleep out at a park for politics and how that's presented, they're often portrayed as diehards, deviants, and outsiders. And this is a sort of a challenge that activists face in trying to get their message to the media, sort of these traditional frames, because what the politics of Occupy Wall Street is doing is militating against this general consumer culture. And that is something which, if you're going against the norm as opposed to participating in it, that presents a challenge in trying to get your story, your image, and your ideas out there.
That's a very interesting comparison, Patrick. I have to admit, I wasn't at Occupy Ottawa, but I followed along thanks to some very avid Twitterers and tweets. What role did social media play in the movement? What could you see happening on the ground?
Well, yeah, what you could see happening on the ground, what I was doing as well, is I was sort of tweeting things out there. And so you can put information out there, whether people are trying to meet up, or again, because this is a global movement taking place in over 80 countries, you could follow what was happening in other cities. So you could sort of get this sense that you are participating in something global. And the last time something this big happened was the move against the 2003 war in Iraq, and the move against, the war in Iraq. And we all know how that turned out. But at the same time, it's important to remember that social media is great for mobilizing activism, but it is also used by the police to monitor what is going on, right? So it's a great organizing tool, good for visibility, but it's not just a one-way street. It's also used by surveillance by the state and authorities.
Patrick, there's so much more to talk about, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it as the days and weeks unfold. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Patrick McCurdy is an assistant professor at the Department of Communications at the University of Ottawa. Were you there over the weekend, or maybe you're still there? Why did you go, and what did you get out of it? Ottawa Morning at cbc.ca. Dave Brown is here with a look at the roads. Dave?